Hello, I'm Karma Kitai, and I am your host for A Livelihood, New Adventures as We Age. And if you've watched this show before, you know we interview people over age 50 who have started any new and exciting adventures. So today I'm going to introduce you to David Goulet, who is very involved in a project in the sister city in Nicaragua. So let me welcome you, David.
Thank you so much.
So I've talked to you a little bit about your history, where you've been and where you are now, and I know you're very involved. In fact, you're the VP, you told me, of this sister city between Newton and
It's called San Juan del Sur.
Uh-huh.
And of course, Brookline has a sister city in Nicaragua also.
Brookline does also.
And Providence has one, and Concord has one, and Pittsfield has one, and Bennington has one, and New Haven has one.
Many.
And so these go back to the 1980s. We've had ours for almost 25 years.
Right. So you have many projects going on.
Yes, my plate's very full.
Mm-hmm. And you and your wife, actually, Margaret, who has also been on this show, I know spend quite a bit of time actually in Nicaragua.
Right.
And probably thinking about it and organizing things. And
we're both writers and activists. So we both spend time in front of our computers, but we also spend time in the field, largely in Nicaragua.
And I know that you haven't always done this. You were an English professor
at
Simmons College,
yes.
Correct?
My joke is that, like the typical English professor, I, in midlife, turned to public health, which in fact is what I'm doing now down in Nicaragua, which is very fascinating. But
Well, I thought when you told me that, what does this have to do with being an English professor?
Well, it's
so
kind
how
of odd.
did you make that transition?
I'm a poet also, and I have a book of poems that I hope will be coming out in the coming year. I've written 2 books about poetry in Nicaragua, about revolutionary poetry in Nicaragua. The Nicaraguans had their great revolution in 1979 when they overthrew the Somoza dynasty, and a lot of poets were involved in that.
When you go down there now, do you do any poetry writing workshops?
No, I don't at all. No, as you'll see from some of our slides, the Newton Sister City Project, Margaret and I, each of us has a different project. She has her free high school for adults, because if you're over 18, if you've ever been married, if you have a kid, you can't go to the public high school. There's a huge population of people that need to go to high school and haven't until now been able to, but now Rosalena Bello, who's Margaret's colleague and now the mayor of our town, first woman mayor, founded this high school 10 years ago. I do several things which we'll show you some slides of. When we began to visit people in the backwoods of San Juan del Sur, we realized a number of things. One was that the water they were drinking was really terrible. They're mostly hand-dug wells. There are animals running everywhere. There are latrines rather than flush toilets. So that typically these wells are full of E. coli bacteria and parasite cysts, which are like the eggs for parasites, as well as occasionally some viruses. So I discovered, while cruising on the internet, a wonderful invention that some Canadians have now made famous around the world, called the biosand filter, which is a column of sand. You take the contaminated water, run it down through the column of sand very slowly, comes out a spout, and what that sand does is to eliminate 100% of parasite cysts and about 95% of E. coli bacteria. Traditionally, the biosand filters, there are about 1 million of them around the world, in Southeast Asia and Africa and other parts of the world. They have traditionally been made out of cement, and we made about 700 of them and distributed them to families made out of cement. They're incredibly heavy, 333 pounds without the sand in them.
Yeah.
A couple of people said, why don't we try to make these out of large pieces of plastic? My friend Dennis St. John, who divides his time between Rockport, Massachusetts, and a little town in Arizona, designed one made out of 10-inch PVC pipe, the kind of pipe that you use for water mains. And then, in the photograph we just saw, a graduate student at Lehigh University in Pennsylvania said, why don't we try to make one out of the regular 5-gallon bucket that everyone uses in their gardens? And she tried that in her lab. She had good results, and she said, could you help me do field trials, really on location, which is what we did last January. It's an amazing invention.
Yeah.
And we've installed, Newton has installed now over 700 of them in the last 5 or 6 years.
All right, so that's one.
That's one thing we do.
One project, and then
Another is, as I think I told you before we began, here's a stunning statistic. More people on this planet, as many as 2 million, will die this coming year of cooking smoke than die of malaria. So we're all horrified of malaria. We think it's this terrible killer. But in fact, cooking on open fires, which is what most people on this planet do to cook their meals, is very dangerous. In Nicaragua,
well,
typically
especially in an enclosed space.
Exactly. In Nicaragua, typically it's a shed attached to the house. They sometimes have a raised platform, and they build a little fire on 4 pieces of brick or 3 pieces, three rocks, and they put the pot on top, and they simply feed wood in underneath, like a campfire. So Fidel Pavona, my friend Fidel, and I developed what we call our eco stove, which is a cement and brick cooking box with, on the top, 2 circles, one for your rice, or 2 holes really, one for your rice, one for your beans. It's quite shallow, and a 3rd small hole for a chimney. And we make our own chimney stacks out of cement. We have a cement mold that goes right up through the roof. And when we go to the next slide, you'll see that it's been installed, and you put the wood in the bottom. It's like a long rectangle. There, if you put the wood right in the front there, keep the fire going. The air comes in, keeps the fire burning. You can cook 2 different things at once, and there at the end is one of our chimneys. Rises right up. It costs about $30. The materials. You can install one in about 2 hours. And then I'll say one last thing that we like to do, and this is a fairly new project of ours. All of us are deeply, deeply interested in the question of global warming and of climate change. And we realize that the tropics, as we learned this week from the Philippines, the tropics are going to suffer more and earlier and longer from climate change than the temperate zones of the world, the Midwest notwithstanding. So some of us who care about these things have been thinking about products we take for granted, like cement and iron. Most of the buildings around us are made of cement with iron rebar in them. So there is a whole movement now, which is called the Green Building Materials Movement. And I have a friend who lives in San Juan del Sur, an American, who's been deeply, deeply involved in finding new methods, homemade methods, as it were, for building buildings. I think we have a slide of a wonderful machine we have called the compressed earth block press. It's a manually operated machine which takes a mixture of sand and clay, a little bit of water, and there we are, and compresses it. Our friend Antonia there is pushing down. She's actually already compressed it. She's about to lift it up. You see in the background those brown brick-like things? Those are earth blocks. They're made out of, there's no cement in them. They're made out of sand and clay, compressed at very high pounds per square inch. We put a big black plastic over them, let them cure slowly, dry slowly for 2 weeks, and they are as hard as rock, harder than most bricks, in fact. And there's I think one last slide. We have a picture of a little hexagonal preschool we built for a small community, and we used local trees, fast-growing trees for the uprights instead of iron and cement. We used bamboo for the shutters rather than wrought iron grills. And there you see on the right our compressed earth blocks. On the left, we actually made our own stucco.
So tell me, David, about this book.
Well, I am
Nicaragua.
I am a novelist also, and the book, which I think there's maybe a slide of, there's the cover, which I wrote after I began to go to Nicaragua. There was in about 1989 something called the Veterans Peace Convoy. A lot of Vietnam veterans who were upset with what Ronald Reagan was doing by declaring war on the second poorest country in the hemisphere, which was Nicaragua. This is the Contra War we're talking about. Many of these Vietnam veterans got together, including the very famous group in Dorchester called the Smedley Butler Brigade of the Vietnam Veterans Against the War. They put together a convoy of 100 trucks and buses, and they decided they were going to do something nice for Nicaragua. And they lined these up, and they met from all parts of the country. They headed down to Texas to cross the border into Mexico. They were stopped at the border